In this lecture, we'll have a look at running requests with different datasets in Postman. And to better understand what this means, let's take a look at this very simple example. Now, in this case, I'm making a post request against an API, which in this case accepts orders. And I'm sending some data with it, like which product I would like to order. So I'm having the product and AB933 is the product code. What happens in practice is that you want to take the exact same request, but try different data. Like for example, what happens if I order the product MX332? Or if I insert a space between AB and the numbers? Or if I use small caps? Or if I only use numbers? Or if I send something like a null? And these are all cases that APIs generally have to cover. And there are multiple ways on how you can create datasets. One way would be to duplicate the request and simply change the data, or to manually change the data every time you're doing sort of a manual testing. But because we want to look into the direction of making everything automated and not doing any manual work, the first option isn't really going to work for us. The second option would be to use pre-request scripts and variables and workflows. And I did other tutorials on that, on how you can do that. And the third option is to use external data files. Now, let's not make this too theoretical and jump directly into Postman to show you what I mean by that. Take this collection, for example. I have created here a very simple workflow on different steps that need to happen. And you will find this collection attached to this video so you can download it and play with it on your own computer. Now, the backend servers are just for testing purposes, so there are no changes there. But let me explain you briefly what's happening here. Now, the first request generate reference will call an endpoint and give back a reference. Now, this will be saved as a global variable and used later in the main request in which we are interested in. And this is create order. So what this request is supposed to do is to create an order. It will get some dynamic data from a previous request. So this request needs to run in a specific sequence. And additionally, it would send information like a customer ID and a product ID. And then the third request will simply check a status. So everything is pretty simple. Now, going back to this request in the middle, as you can see here, we have some hard-coded data. And we already have some tests written for that. And they're all checking that the customer ID is 200 and the product ID is 300 in this case. But what happens if we want to test against different information, different customers, different products, to see how this behaves? And exactly this is the case now when we are going to define this information in an external file and then use the collection runner to inject this information into Postman. So let's first go ahead and define this external file that I was talking about. I'm using right now Visual Studio Code, which is totally free to download. And the feature that I'm looking here into is that I create a valid file. Now you can define this data set in JSON or you can use CSV. Now I've decided to use JSON for this example, and generally JSON is a bit more powerful than CSV. So for that reason, let's now stick to JSON and give it a try. Now I'm using Visual Studio Code because when writing JSON, it is important that you write valid JSON. Otherwise, if your JSON contains any mistakes, then Postman will not be able to understand it and the whole scenario will not work. Now, the way you define multiple iteration is by putting everything in an array. So this is the array that I'm defining and it will contain all my iterations. And inside that array, there will be objects containing values. Now, what I can do initially is to just create two empty objects. So let's save this file and go back to Postman. Now in Postman, what I will do is to start the collection runner. And here I will select my collection. I don't have any environment. And I will be selecting the file that I have just created. It will recognize that this is an JSON file and will offer this preview button. Now what we will see here is that we have two iterations, but we don't have any additional data, and that is fine for the moment. I'm gonna hit here the run button. And you will see now that the collection has been executed 2 times. So the first iteration is here, and just below it is the second iteration. Now all the tests are green and everything is working just fine. And this means that I have now defined 2 iterations in my case. Let's go ahead and make this a bit more sophisticated. So going back to the JSON file, let's try and edit some information here. So what I'll do in this case is I will define customer ID with a value. And let's say that this value is now 9,000. And let's now define a product ID as well. I'm gonna duplicate this. And let's create a new iteration as well. So now we have 3 iterations. So let's play a bit with this data so that it's a bit different. Now the information doesn't really matter. But now what we have is that we have these 3 different iterations: customer ID, product ID, and these are all different data that we will insert now in the body of the request. So let's save it and go back to Postman. So now if we edit the body of the create order request and replace customer ID with double curly brackets, and as we have named the value customer ID in the JSON file, this is the way we're gonna call it here as well. And the same goes for product ID. I'm gonna save it and let's open the collection runner again. I'm gonna select the collection, select the data file again. And now if I click the preview button, you'll be able to see that I have multiple iterations, in this case 3 iterations. And now customer ID and product ID have different value for each iteration. So let's see how this plays out. Let's run the collection. You can see that now we have 1, 2, 3 iterations, but we also have some failed tests as well, but we will take care of that later. Let's first make sure that what we have done actually worked. And the way we do this is, in this case, for the first iteration in create order, we click the name of the request and then we can inspect the request body. And you will see now in the request body, we have customer ID 9000, product ID 5. So it means that the information that we have defined in the JSON file, in an external JSON file, has been now injected in our request. We are sure that the information that we have defined in a JSON file is actually being picked up by Postman and used in the request.